We're in the early 1950s, and through the 1950s, it was a period of intense fear in the United States. Americans were told to believe that the Soviet Union was likely to launch a nuclear attack against American cities at any moment with no warning. This led to a whole number of bizarre projects, of which MK-Ultra might have been the most bizarre. So the CIA concluded that the Soviets had perfected a process that would allow them to capture the minds of other people. The CIA decided we need to find ways to seize control of people's minds. Before you can figure out how to insert a new mind into someone's brain, you first have to figure out how to destroy the mind that's in there. I found what I think might be the first ever CIA secret prison. And it was there that the MK-Ultra project began.
Commitment to a great cause is the most powerful motivation to commit immoral acts. And there's no cause that's more seductive than patriotism. And I'd love to ask a very basic question for people that may be listening or watching this interview who are just beginning to get familiar with your work and your book about MK-Ultra and Sidney Gottlieb. For that audience, I'd love to give some time to give a basic overview of who this man was and what MK-Ultra was.
Let me start by saying this is my 10th book, Poisoner in Chief.
Yeah.
And over the previous 9 books, I've discovered and reported a number of things that surprised me, and they may have shocked a lot of readers. But this is the first time I have been shocked. I still can't wrap my mind around the fact that there was such a person as Sidney Gottlieb and there was such a CIA program as MK-Ultra. When you're a biographer, you're really living with the person about whom you're writing. So I was locked in the room with this bizarre character, Sidney Gottlieb, who I think was probably the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. And over the period I was writing Poisoner in Chief, I had to essentially have him looking over my shoulder or having him sit right next to me in my tiny little office. It was scary because of who he was and what he did. So let me start with just a brief overview. First of all, you have to understand the climate of the times. We're in the early 1950s, and through the 1950s, it was a period of intense fear in the United States. Americans were told to believe, and did believe, that the Soviet Union was likely to launch a nuclear attack against American cities at any moment with no warning. The entire future of civilization on Earth and the possibility of a fulfilling, meaningful human existence would be wiped away by that. Therefore, the challenge was so immense and the threat was so dire that any technique, any tactic, any project would be considered acceptable if it seemed to combat that danger. This led to a whole number of bizarre projects, of which MK-Ultra might have been the most bizarre. So it was in that climate that Sidney Gottlieb was hired at the CIA in 1951. He was a biochemist and had worked in a few government-related jobs. He was living in the Washington area. And by his own account, he wasn't quite sure what the job entailed. He was going to become the first head of the chemical division of the CIA. Now, years later, Gottlieb was fingered as the chemist who made the poisons that were used by the CIA to try to kill Fidel Castro repeatedly, that killed Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, a poison to try to kill Zhou Enlai. All those poisons were made by Gottlieb, which made sense because he was the chief chemist at the CIA. And during the 1950s and into the 60s, he was probably the world's leading expert on poisons. He knew how to find poisons from animals and plants all over the world. He researched them. He knew what effects they would have. That's why I called my book Poisoner in Chief. However, Gottlieb's real story was covered up, I think, by his implication in the poison making for killing foreign leaders. Actually, that was not such a big deal inside the CIA. If Gottlieb hadn't been there, somebody else would have made the poisons. It's just a pharmacist's job glorified. But as I was digging into Gottlieb, I realized that making poisons to kill foreign leaders was just a sidelight for him. That was something very small. The huge story was MK-Ultra, and that was a project that Gottlieb conceived and designed himself. So unlike the making of poisons to kill foreign leaders, this was a project that came strictly out of Gottlieb's bizarre mind. What did it mean? What did it entail? So the CIA, based on misinterpretation of a couple of world events, concluded that the Soviets, or the communists, as we called them, had perfected or were about to perfect a process that would allow them to capture the minds of other people. This terrified the CIA because, of course, if that were true, the prize would be nothing less than global mastery. You could seize everybody's mind and make them do what you want. You couldn't dream of anything more ideal as an intelligence service. So the CIA decided we have to do the same thing. We need to find ways to seize control of people's minds. And they dropped this challenge in Gottlieb's lap. Being a scientist, he began with two scientific observations. The first was his conclusion that before you can figure out how to insert a new mind into someone's brain, you first have to figure out how to destroy the mind that's in there. And he spent years and years using every technique to try to destroy a human mind and a human body and a human soul. He had what amounted to a license to kill issued by the US government. He could go to foreign countries and have the CIA station or the military police turn him over, half a dozen prisoners or as many as he wanted, and he could experiment on them to death if he wanted to, and he did. So that was the first thing he figured out, that you got to find out how to destroy the mind first. And the second thing he decided was that, as with any new scientific project, you want to look around and see how much research is out there already that you can build on. So he had to ask himself, who is there out there that knows how to destroy minds and how to destroy bodies and how to ruin people's lives and destroy them? A lot of these would be data that the United States wouldn't have access to, because in order to learn that stuff, you have to kill a lot of people. So what did he do? He figured out the people who really know how to do this are the Nazi scientists who worked in the concentration camps with their so-called experiments that were nothing more than medical torture, and their Japanese counterparts who in some cases were doing things even more brutal than what the Nazis were doing. So Gottlieb scooped up these people, all the torturers and the medical doctors who worked on concentration camp victims and killed them while they were alive, became part of the CIA project. So that launched about a decade-long effort by the CIA, directed strictly by Sidney Gottlieb, to find out a secret that Gottlieb later concluded didn't exist, which is mind control. That was the essence of Project MK-Ultra. It was a search for mind control, and Sidney Gottlieb was the person the CIA had hired to direct that search.
I want to weave some history here for the audience and the listeners, because you just alluded to this, that there was a collaboration, a secret collaboration between German Nazi scientists and the Japanese. And I want to put two different names to you and give you some space to color this in however you would like. The first is Dr. Kurt Blome. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, a Nazi research scientist. And the second is Dr. General Shiro Ishii of Unit 731 in Japan. I'd love to just put those two names and that unit to you and give you however much space you might like to add some context as to what that is.
These were two of the most accomplished medical torturers of the 20th century. Kurt Blome was the chief of biomedical research for the Nazis. He established a so-called research institution that had the cover as being a center for cancer research. In fact, it was a place where prisoners could be brought and subjected to all manner of tortures to see how they responded, how long it took for them to die under various forms of torture. The Japanese had their own equivalent of Kurt Blome. That was General Ishii. So this person was one of the most bizarre sadists imaginable. He established a whole campus of torture installations in Manchuria, in northern China, in the run-up to the Second World War, and maintained it during the Second World War. Thousands of people, many of them bandits and many of them Chinese partisans, people that were fighting against the Japanese, or prisoners. By the thousands, they were brought in there. They were called logs. And Ishii would get these logs, and then he would find ways to torture them. He was trying to find out, how long does it take a person to die once you cut his legs open? Or when you feed them this kind of poison or inject it into their body, what kinds of torments do they go through? And could they survive? And if they survive, would their minds be still there? Or how quickly would they die? So these two guys and people who had worked with them became counselors to the CIA. Both of them would have been hanged had the CIA not picked them up. They would have been hanged as war criminals. But they were given a really nice choice, which is either we can hang you or you can come to work for us. And they came to work for the CIA. Just to give one little example, one of those Nazi scientists that had worked with Kurt Blome came to the CIA headquarters. They didn't want to bring Blome in. It was the idea to do that, but later on it was concluded that his background was so dicey, they shouldn't try to get a visa for him to get him into the United States. So one of the people he worked with came. And what was the subject of this guy's lecture to the MK-Ultra crew? It was a lecture on a couple of intense poisons, particularly sarin gas. And the question was, how much sarin does it take to kill someone? In what strength? And most interestingly, can you kill a baby with the same amount of sarin, or does it only require less sarin to kill a baby than it would to kill an adult? So these were the kinds of data that the CIA didn't have, but the Nazis had them. And so all of the MK-Ultra project was based on a foundation that came from the very powers that we had been fighting only a few years earlier. So when I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I found what I think might be the first ever CIA secret prison. It's in a beautiful chalet outside of Frankfurt. Looks like a B&B where you'd sit and have wine in the afternoon. And it was there that the MK-Ultra project began torturing and killing people. Now, I went there, and the house has now been bought by some young German businessman. He was cutting it up into condos. He was very open, and he took me down into the basement and showed me his storage rooms. And he said to me, these rooms were the torture chambers where the MK-Ultra men, under Gottlieb's supervision, were carrying out experiments that were essentially just continuations of the experiments these same Nazi doctors had been conducting only a few years earlier, just down the road at concentration camps. And then he told me, the people in this neighborhood, in this area, all know what happened in this house. In fact, there was a big magazine article in Der Spiegel about it, calling it the CIA's torture house. And he said to me, the people around here have told me that the victims who were experimented to death in this house were buried in the forest, right in this neighborhood, in places that are now covered over with shopping malls and apartment blocks. So I could walk through there and get the sense that this was the place where unwitting prisoners were taken to be subjected to these extreme experiments by this bizarre chemist who was a senior employee of the CIA.
I want to give a little more context. You gave some earlier as to what the situation was globally, geopolitically at the time when we believed that launching a program like this was justified. And I know you go into your book in your book, you go into some stories about, former POWs that come back from, I think it was the Korean War, and we were convinced that they had been successfully brainwashed, essentially, from communist agents. And correct me where I'm off base here, but I'd love to give you some time to also give a fuller picture of the context as to how, from the American perspective, we justified the sort of behavior, these sort of, torturous experiments that, we probably justified in our own minds because of the threat we were facing and because of the technology, the mind control technology that we thought, the Russians and the communists had already obtained. I'd love to put that to you and give you any time you'd like to respond to that.
It's an interesting story because it shows you how you always tend to see what you're looking for. When you're searching for evidence to prove something you already believe, you have what's called confirmation bias. You accept all the evidence that confirms your thesis and you reject everything that tells you something different. So how did the CIA get the idea that there's such a thing as mind control? And secondly, that the communists had mastered it? The answer to the first question, I think, is cultural more than political. These guys who took over the CIA after it was founded in 1947 had grown up in a cultural environment in which there were so many stories and books and movies about mind control. Think of all the movies you've seen where some hypnotist waves a little claw watch in front of someone's eyes, or hypnotizes them somehow and makes them go and kill someone or do something they would normally never do. There are Sherlock Holmes and James Bond and endless numbers of stories that I think conditioned those guys to believe that if fantasists and screenplay writers and novelists could imagine something, it must be true. There must be an element of truth to it. So they extrapolated from this wild fantasy, the false presumption that there must be something there. So that was the deeper background. Now, in the period of the early Cold War, there were two episodes that, in the CIA's mind, confirmed the fact that communist powers had mastered the secret of mind control. The first came in Hungary. The Roman Catholic prelate of Hungary was arrested by the communist authorities and held in jail for some months. Later on, he was put on trial in a show trial in which he confessed to crimes that he obviously had not committed and was finally convicted and punished. Now, for the outside world, it seemed clear that this was another show trial and not to be taken seriously. But at the CIA, it was seen very differently. They didn't so much care about what the cardinal said, but they paid attention to the way he spoke. They said that he spoke in a dull monotone, that his eyes seemed glazed, that he seemed to be repeating words without really feeling them. So that later turned out that the cardinal had been beaten and abused with techniques that people have been using for thousands of years: sustained isolation and repeated questioning and sleep deprivation, all the things that people have thought about for many generations. But that was too easy an explanation. The CIA didn't think that. They thought, no, somebody somewhere has grabbed control of this guy's mind and is speaking through him. That wasn't true. But if it were true, that would confirm everything the CIA feared and believed. And that's what they looked for. So that was the first episode that terrified them and sent them off onto this wild goose chase. The second was the one to which you referred, and that was the prisoners who had been captured by communist forces during the Korean War and then released after the war was over. It turned out that some of those prisoners had signed statements accusing the United States of having committed war crimes in Korea. And some of them said they committed war crimes themselves. Among those crimes were the dropping of chemical weapons, use of bioweapons, use of the dropping of fleas and contaminated bugs to create plagues. The United States has always denied that we did use any biowarfare in Korea. Some of them signed statements denouncing racism and other injustices in the United States. This was completely shocking once it was revealed in the United States. How could our strapping young men have concluded that the United States was anything less than a perfect society? How could they have confessed to doing anything evil or wrong during their military service? The idea that these people were speaking sincerely also was immediately rejected. There had to be something more there. And so, as you suggest, the idea grew at the CIA that these people had been brainwashed. This was a new term that just emerged during the 1950s, coined by a guy who was actually a CIA contractor. Now, as those prisoners were returning home from North Korea, a number of them were sent on a train ride across China to get to a point where they could be released. And the train carried them across northern China through the province of Manchuria. This led to this concept that a brainwashed person is a Manchurian candidate, as the movie later called it. So that's where you get the idea of something of connecting Manchuria with mind control. So these two episodes, the show trial of the Hungarian prelate, and then the returning Korean War veterans, reinforced the certainty at the CIA that something was true, which we now know was not true, which was that the Chinese or the Russians or someone in the service of the communists had cracked the code, had resolved that age-old dilemma of how to control people's minds, and was now in possession of a weapon that could allow it to dominate the world. That was the motivation that allowed the CIA to hire someone like Sidney Gottlieb and tell him, do whatever you want to do. Don't tell us. This was a big part of the deal. I think they realized that the person in this job was going to have blood on his hands. This guy was going to be a torturer. And Sidney Gottlieb was certainly the most accomplished American torturer of his generation, that the guy would be killing people. And I think that's one of the reasons they selected Gottlieb. Don't forget that at the CIA in the early days, all the senior officers came from the same backgrounds. They all went to Ivy League schools. Before that, they'd gone to the same prep schools. They dated the same girls. They went to work for the same Wall Street law firms and investment banks. They played golf in the same places. They were members of the same yacht clubs. It was a very closed elite. But when they wanted to choose somebody to head their chemical division, they did something they didn't do for any of their other hires at that level, and that was find someone totally different from them, somebody who had nothing to do with their class, their background. Sidney Gottlieb was Jewish. He stuttered. He had a limp. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. He had gone to Hebrew school. He was so different from everyone else at the CIA. And I suspect that this is one of the reasons they chose him. They felt that this is going to be an awful project, and maybe it will even become some kind of a scandal. We want to be able to have someone in this job who we can throw under the bus, who we can blame it all on. We can say one guy went crazy, but that can't be one of us because that would not be elegant. So let's choose somebody that we wouldn't mind throwing under the bus at some later point, someone who's very different from us. And actually, this is more or less what happened. Many years later, when Gottlieb was hauled before investigators in Washington, he complained that the CIA was releasing documents tangentially related to MK-Ultra or to his assassination plots, in which all the signatures are blacked out except for Gottlieb's. And he thought the reason for that was so that he would get all the blame. And I think he was probably right.
Fascinating. I'd love to give a little bit more time to the details. And I know this is some gory, grisly stuff, but you alluded to this earlier in the conversation of I think you said he was America's top torturer of his generation. And I'd love to give you some time to go into whatever detail you'd like about what we know about what he did, what he and people who worked for him did in terms of the torture I assume in the attempt, most of the time or all of the time, in obtaining this mind control technology. You may disagree with that, but I'd love to just give you some space to give voice to that in your knowledge about what we know he did, what kind of torture was really involved in the MK-Ultra program.
First of all, let me start by saying that we know very little about what MK-Ultra was and what it did. At the end of Gottlieb's career, with the collaboration of the then outgoing CIA director, he ordered all MK-Ultra records destroyed. Destruction of federal property is a felony. And that's why when he called the CIA Record Center in Maryland and told them to destroy these crates of evidence, the guy wouldn't do it. The archivist wouldn't do it. And Gottlieb had to drive out there himself. And you can see in his notes from that night, he said that he destroyed 5 crates of MK-Ultra documents, quote, over my stated objection. So we don't know. And I'm painfully aware of the fact that my book, Poisoner in Chief, although it probably tells more about MK-Ultra than you can find out anywhere else, only tells a very small part of the story. There must be so much more we don't know and probably never will know. I got a whole raft of emails and letters after I wrote this book from people who thought that they or their parents or friends or relatives had been victims of MK-Ultra. And I could only tell them what the CIA was able to tell them in the late 1970s, which is, we have no idea. We don't know. We have no records. So what do we know? Well, Gottlieb, first of all, had 2 kinds of experiments. One was the kind that he conducted in the United States, which were under some limits, and the others were experiments that he conducted abroad. I was able to get the CIA to release to me while I was writing Poisoner in Chief, Gottlieb's personnel record. And that shows some of the places that he traveled on his bogus CIA passport. He would travel especially to Europe, Germany in particular, and to Japan, and to the Philippines and South Korea, all countries that were more or less under American control. And when he got there, he could requisition a number of what he called expendables, that is, human beings who wouldn't be missed by anyone. And then he would take them to one of these secret prisons where they would be abused in various ways. So what kind of ways? Well, drugs were Gottlieb's favorite tool because he was a chemist and really a visionary chemist in many ways, going off in this very bizarre direction. So he would, for example, and then he would combine drugs with various other kinds of techniques. For example, he would overdose a person with sedatives to the point where the person was in a full coma. Then he would overdose the person with amphetamines. So the person would go from a coma state to a hyperactive state, massively overdosed in both directions. Then, when the person was in the transition state from coma to hyperactivity, he would be given massive amounts of electroshock. And then sometimes all this would be done inside an isolation cabinet, which was something like a coffin where you couldn't move or get out. And then he would try to measure, how long does it take a person to die under those circumstances? What if you take them out after a certain number of hours? How much of their mind would they have lost? So he was constantly trying new combinations of drugs, along with sensory deprivation, electroshock, and every other technique that he could think of to try to unlock what he thought was this trove of secret lore. Again, we don't know how many people were killed under those experiments, but I did find in the course of researching my book a couple of messages in which these expendables, people that are going to be experimented on, are being sent over, and there's an assurance made, there will not be a disposal problem. That means to say, we're not going to kill this guy. That's called a disposal problem. We have to think of what to do with the body. So send us 4 people, there won't be a disposal problem. That means they'll just be tortured and they won't be killed. So that must mean that there were other times when they were killed. So these were the most extreme experiments that Gottlieb carried out. And he would take people in Asia, for example, prisoners, place them in a room, and try to, through starvation, drug use, flashing lights, extreme noise, convince them to hate each other and leave guns there and see if they would kill each other and see how much time that would take. At one point, when he just got fed up with the experiment, he just ordered about a half a dozen of them all to be shot and thrown overboard. So the experiments abroad, outside the United States, were undoubtedly the most deadly. Now, what did he do inside the United States? Gottlieb was especially fascinated with LSD. He was really the first LSD maven. Soon after LSD was discovered, in the years after World War II, Gottlieb came to think that this was a drug. It was colorless, it was odorless, and it could be so powerful in such small doses that this could be, as one of his scientists said, the key that could unlock the universe. So Gottlieb was fascinated to know more about LSD, and he incorporated LSD into a number of his experiments in other countries. But inside the United States, he focused on LSD more intently, and he did that in 2 ways. Number one was coercive, brutal experiments. MK-Ultra and Gottlieb established a network of people in the United States who were doctors, including in Canada as well, who would be willing to be his experimenters, essentially. And I give you one example of one of the few cases we've been able to document. Gottlieb worked with the doctor and warden at the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. He had the doctor segregate 7 African-American inmates, put them in one large cell, and then, according to the protocol, which we have, give them double and triple doses of LSD every day for 77 days to try to find out what would this do to a human mind? Would it destroy it? We don't know the answer. My guess is the answer is yes, that will definitely destroy a human mind. It led me naturally to wonder, whatever happened to those poor 7 guys? Did they ever know what had happened to them? Nobody ever apparently told them they were being given a drug. Or did they survive? Nobody would ever know, and that was not part of the experiment. In another MK-Ultra experiment in the prison in Georgia, of the famous Boston gangster Whitey Bulger became a subject for MK-Ultra. We know this because he's written about it. He was told that there was a project underway to try to find the causes of schizophrenia, and that they needed to try different drugs as schizophrenia curatives. He wrote that the LSD they gave him was so intense. He said he couldn't talk about it because he's afraid if he mentioned what he was seeing and what was happening to him, they would never let him out again. He would see the animals crawling over the walls. For the rest of his life, he couldn't sleep in the dark. He had to have a light on all the time. As he wrote in his account of this, I committed a crime to be there, but they committed a greater crime on me. And he was so angry that 20 years later, in the 70s, when the beginnings of MK-Ultra began to emerge into the press, Whitey Bulger told the other guys in his gang, I'm going to find that Dr. Isbell. I'm going to go back to Georgia. I'm going to find him, and I'm going to kill him. Now, as far as we know, he never did. But that's how intense it was. So you have all these experiments going on with massive overdoses of LSD, in some cases combined with other drugs and electroshock and extended sensory deprivation. But there was another piece of the LSD fascination that drove Gottlieb. He wanted to see how ordinary people would respond to LSD under normal clinical circumstances. But of course, the CIA doesn't maintain clinics where this could be done. So Gottlieb set up a couple of bogus medical foundations, printed up their own letterhead, and he sent out letters to a number of hospitals and clinics, including Veterans Administration hospitals, and told them essentially, we have this new drug. It's called LSD. It's psychoactive. He laid the whole thing out. He said, what we'd like you to do is put an ad in the newspaper, explain exactly what the substance is, and say, we're looking for volunteers who could come in and take this, and then write reports on what they saw, and we pay you for that. And of course, the CIA, through this foundation, would reimburse the clinics and hospitals for whatever money they paid to the volunteers and however much it cost to carry out those experiments. So almost overnight, a whole new market emerged for these experiments because it was a great thing for hospitals to do. They get the LSD, they get the money, and all they have to do is file reports. So ordinary citizens came in and became subjects of these LSD experiments. Who were some of the very first people to come in and take LSD under these circumstances? One was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who later went on to become one of the great gurus of LSD. Another was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who then brought the LSD to the Grateful Dead and to all the people that followed them. Another one was Ken Kesey, the author of that great counterculture Bible, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I actually found an interview in which he said that he had worked in a mental hospital, but he said, it's mistakenly believed that I went to work in that hospital to gather material for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He said, I did gather material there, but that wasn't the reason I went to work there. I went to work there because I wanted to steal all the LSD out of the pharmacy, which is what he did. And then he brought it home and started turning on all his friends. So what it means is that Gottlieb is really the person who brought LSD to the United States. And it was through Gottlieb that LSD escaped from the laboratory and went out into the general population. The irony, of course, being that the drug that Sidney Gottlieb thought would give him the power to control the world wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for. So he was fascinated with LSD and at one time thought it was going to be the answer to his great question, but in the end, he concluded what many people would not tell you. LSD is just too unreliable. Makes some people tell the truth, makes some people lie. Makes some people hyperactive, makes others not. You can't tell what it's going to do. So actually, it's not valuable. And you know, this leads to another observation about Gottlieb. He was a poor scientist. He was just throwing things onto the wall to see what would stick. Many of his experiments had no scientific oversight at all. He was not employing people who really understood psychology or who spoke foreign languages. He had this crackpot project in San Francisco where he actually set up a bordello and he hired prostitutes to bring men into this whorehouse, a national security whorehouse established by the CIA. And there, the girls would feed a drink to their clients, and that drink would be laced with whatever chemical Sidney Gottlieb wanted to try that week. And there'd be somebody watching through a one-way mirror. Who was the guy watching? It was usually some fat Drug Enforcement Administration administrator, a guy who used to sit on a portable toilet and drink martinis out of a pitcher. It was not somebody that really understood how to interpret people's actions. So although he fancied himself on the very cutting edge of science, actually Gottlieb was not much of a scientist at all by conventional standards.
Fascinating. And at the end of this, what was the determination of all of these experiments, right? I mean, ostensibly the mission was to obtain this new technology, this new capacity for mind control. I think this program went on for a decade or more. I'd love to give you some time to talk about that. What was the eventual determination of all of this work, all of this torture? How did that end up?
In one way, this is among the most sobering parts of the story. after those years of research and destroying countless human beings, Gottlieb concluded that the whole thing was pointless, that actually there was no such thing as mind control. You cannot make a person do something because of some process that that person is fundamentally opposed to doing. Actually, some psychologists have been telling this to Gottlieb. Carl Menninger, the great mental health expert from the Midwest, wrote to him and said, you're barking up the wrong tree. This is not something that's real. It's only something that's in movies. And finally, Gottlieb came to conclude that this was true. So he wound the project down in a very interesting way. And in order to understand why it's interesting, you have to know a little bit more about Gottlieb as a person. This is another bizarre aspect of the story, and I try to focus on this in Poisoner in Chief as much as possible. And that is, who was Gottlieb as a private person, as a private citizen, when he wasn't out torturing people? Actually, he was a sweetheart. He was a lovely family man and asset to his community. This was a guy who raised his own vegetables. He meditated. He wrote poetry. He studied Zen Buddhism. He got up before dawn to milk his goats. So I come to wonder, how can these two pieces coexist in one mind? Was it maybe that there was some kind of an invisible miasma over the Potomac River, and that when he would drive to work, he would kind of leave behind this lovely, warm personality and assume his other Jekyll and Hyde side? Or was it that he was able to put these together in some way and justify it? So at the end of the MK-Ultra era, in the late 50s and early 60s, there were growing concerns at the CIA. Gottlieb actually became almost not a pariah, but people understood that he was doing some very strange and bad things, that he was involved with LSD and he was involved with drugs. And so it was suggested in a Inspector General report at the CIA that the MK-Ultra program should be restricted or limited, or it should begin to wind down. And so what did Gottlieb do? He didn't respond the way a normal bureaucrat might, which is, you're trying to take away my fief? No, I'm not going to let you do that. I got to hold on to my project. He did the opposite. He said, you're so right. It was very Zen. He said, you're so right. Actually, it shouldn't even be wound down. It should be ended. It didn't work. There's no such thing as mind control. I think I'll move on to another project in the CIA. So it was like just looking at all those lives over all those years and saying, never mind. It happened. It was a little bit of a mistake. And maybe no one will find out about it, and I'll just move on. So even Gottlieb, in the end, concluded that the whole search was pointless. And it has to make you wonder, did he ever look back on everything he had done, realizing that from the beginning, it had no prospect of success?
I wrote this down, your comment about, I heard you say about him once, about Gottlieb, and you called him, quote, a gentle-hearted torturer. And you talked earlier about how so much of the, as I understand it, the documents that detail the work of MK-Ultra were destroyed. So there's no way to know definitively so many of the details of what happened in the program. But I'd love, if you're interested in it, to speculate based on, reasonable estimations and just maybe intuition based on how much work you did researching him and the program. If you had to bet, conceding that we don't know definitively, if those files had never been destroyed, what would be your hunch as to what would be discovered in them?
I suspect they are protocols of individual experiments. You'd be able to find out how many people were captured on a certain day in Germany, where they were brought, what drugs they were given, and what was the result of the experiment. There might have been a lot of communication among the people who were running MK-Ultra. I don't think you would have found much in between Gottlieb and the director of the CIA, because the director of the CIA at that time, Alan Dulles, would not have wanted to know about these things. You know, in the CIA culture and in the culture of secret services in general, ignorance is sometimes an asset. You want to be able to say you didn't know anything about it. And Gottlieb thrived in that environment. I think he understood that he wasn't supposed to say anything, and nobody wanted to hear it. Now, how could he have put together in his own mind these two seemingly totally opposite parts of his personality? The calm, sweet family man who meditated and loved his goats, and then the most accomplished torturer of his generation. I don't know. One of the ways I hoped to find out while I was writing Poisoner in Chief was to go and talk to Gottlieb's 3 surviving adult children. So I figured out one of them was the most dominant one. He had an interesting career and was quite public. He was the state archivist in Wisconsin, I believe. So I decided I'm gonna call him, and I telephoned him. Couldn't find him. Tried several places, emailed, started doing Facebook and all those other things. And then I had registered mail and FedEx letters, and I never heard anything. So I decided I'm just going to fly out there. He was living in Madison, I think, and I was just going to doorstop him, as we call it in journalism, just wait and grab him on the street sometime. But before I could do that, fortunately, I found somebody who was not a family member, but very close to the family. And this person said to me, I can tell you why you didn't hear anything back. It's because right after Gottlieb died, his widow called the children together and made them promise that they would never speak about their father to anyone ever. So this person told me, don't expect to get an answer because they're not going to talk. So that left me to my own guesswork to try to answer this question of how you put these two pieces of his mind together. And I could come up with one possibility. As I said, I lived with this guy for a couple of years, even though he had long been dead. So I got to know him to a certain degree. And here's one way I could imagine that he would justify to himself the heinous tortures that he perpetrated. He might be thinking to himself something like this. I live an unusual life. A lot of people in Washington that work for the government live in these little ticky-tacky developments and all are conventional. I don't do that. I live in the forest in Virginia. I bake my own bread. I have my own, we don't have electricity. I get the water out of the ground. I live a life very different from other people. And that's because I'm in America. I'm allowed to do that. People have an opportunity to express themselves, live the kind of lives that they feel are fulfilling. And that's the essence of freedom. We are now facing a force that is going to destroy not only the United States, but the entire possibility of human freedom on Earth forever. Therefore, if the threat is that great, killing a few people, or even a few hundred people, and even in horrific ways, would be a very small price to pay. I'm actually carrying out these tortures in service of a humanistic goal. And that takes us back to the quote that you mentioned at the beginning, that patriotism is a wonderful excuse that allows people to justify doing almost anything. And I think that's a dangerous message that we should be considering today.
I'm going to read that quote one more time for people. Quote, commitment to a great cause is the most powerful motivation to commit immoral acts. And there's no cause that's more seductive than patriotism. I know this was something I wanted to ask you because, like you said, you spent 2 years researching this man. You understand the context of, you know, the post-World War II era, the early 50s better than surely most people who are alive today. Where do you come down on your view of the behavior of these people? You know, do you have some sympathy, some empathy for what, you know, from a modern perspective, just appears to be outright Nazi-esque torture by our own leadership? Or how do you come down on just from an ethical perspective, this program and this man?
The United States was in a period of true hysteria at this time, and the hysteria was fomented from above. It was also a way to unify the population. This is the one reason Secretary of State John Foster Dulles never wanted Eisenhower to meet the Soviet leaders, because once you start having conversations and you suggest that the Soviet leaders are human beings and you can deal with them and there might be diplomacy, the whole force that binds our country together, knowing that we're under imminent danger, is going to fade away. So I think those people were guilty, the people in the early CIA were guilty of exaggerating threats. And they were doing something that's very American, which is look around the world for enemies. We are a great country for searching for enemies. Let's find the people that want to kill us, and let's go kill them first. So that ethos was very strong in those days. The mindset came from the kind of people that joined the early CIA. These were not people that had a long history in diplomacy or international politics. Their understanding of the world was the understanding you get from Wall Street, from being the career-long lawyer for giant corporations or the banker for giant corporations. That's the way you see the world. It's a place that has to be tamed and brought under American control, which is another way of saying liberated. They have to be made free. They have to be defended against the evil forces in the world. So I think they had a pernicious belief that fed on itself. They really believed they were the only people in America that truly understood the nature of the threat. And you can see some quotes from some of these people saying, there's this giant cancer approaching the United States that's going to destroy us, and we're not even awake to it. One of the leading CIA covert operatives during the 1950s, Frank Wisner, was so overwhelmed by this that he had a complete mental breakdown. He had to be hospitalized. He was found on the Brooklyn Bridge in his pajamas saying that he was out there to stop the Soviets who were about to come across at any time. That was an exaggerated manifestation of a view that was very widespread in the CIA at that time. And it reflects the desire of the United States after the end of World War II to find a new enemy. And we transferred everything that we had hated about the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese onto the Soviets. If the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor without warning, it means the Soviets could attack Washington the same way. If the Nazis established camps and killed millions of people just because they didn't like their religion, then the Soviets would certainly do the same thing with us. So the Soviets were made to seem 10 feet tall, and as we, the United States, were just a small outpost of freedom as the Soviets were advancing everywhere. Once you get into this mindset, almost nothing seems excessive.
Yeah. I've always wondered what it's been like for you to be the author of this book and the popularizer of this program in our culture. You know, this is not a flattering picture of the American system that, you know, you and I have lived in. And I wonder if you have gotten any pushback, intimidation, any kind of negativity from government institutions or governmental power or other forms of power because of your popularizing of the truth and the reality of this history.
Interestingly enough, I have not experienced that. And I'll tell you why I think that is. So much time has passed.
Yeah.
We're able to say that was then. At one time, the family of one of the victims of the MK-Ultra project was granted a meeting with the head of the CIA, Colby. And Colby, talking about MK-Ultra, said, there was a lack of supervision in those times. People did things they shouldn't have done. that's exactly what they had planned to say 25 years earlier. And that's what they did say. So I think the attitude of the CIA now is, gee, that guy really went off the rails. And it's a good thing that we don't do things like that anymore. Nonetheless, it's inevitable, perhaps, that I would have thought as I was finishing writing Poisoner in Chief that maybe some of the things that Gottlieb concluded at the end might not be true. Could there be another Stephen Kinzer living 50 years from now who's going to be writing about what's happening right now in 2014, 2024, 2034? And it will be just as shocking as what I've written about what happened in the 1950s. It also leads me to one other reflection. Gottlieb, after all those years of trying to find the secret of mind control, concluded there's no such thing as mind control. And I think he was right. But he was right at the time that he said it. Now, with all the advances in neuroscience, cyber technology, artificial intelligence, is it still true that mind control is a myth? Or have we now crossed into areas that might make it possible for another modern version of Sidney Gottlieb to be working either at the CIA or at secret services in other countries, working on this exact project? My work in writing Poisoner in Chief has led me to believe that it would be foolish to dismiss the possibility that something similar is going on today, and that today we have such a wider range of frightening possibilities that maybe the book that Gottlieb finally closed about 70 years ago could be being reopened now behind closed doors.
Stephen, this whole subject is just utterly fascinating. I've learned just a ton from your books and your interviews, and I know we're getting close to the end of the conversation today. And I'd love to close with getting your comments on maybe two ideas. And one would be, if there were something like an MK-Ultra program going on right now, what would that look like? You know, obviously, this is speculation. The last question I want to ask is, why is it that so few Americans have any idea in your mind that this happened? I think that was a theme I was receiving as I interviewed you a couple of years ago and talked about this with people I know. I'd love to close the conversation to get your thoughts on both of those.
What would a mind control experiment look like now? I'm thinking that it would involve people who are graduates of Silicon Valley or its equivalents in other countries. The internet is a kind of a mind in itself. Artificial intelligence is even closer to that. And these are ways of trying to duplicate mental processes that go on inside the human mind. If these technologies can begin to map and understand the human mind, the implications are terrifying. There was a long time when Africa was the undiscovered place in the world. Then it was Antarctica. Some people say space is the last unexplored frontier, but really, to me, the brain is the real unexplored frontier. I truly believe, and my writing of Poisoner in Chief reinforced this view, that we only understand and even use a very small portion of our brain. There's so much in there. It's like getting your new cell phone and you don't know what any of those apps are. You have to figure them all out. That's what our mind is today. And I think there's going to come a time when we look back on where we are today and think, we didn't know anything about the human mind. We may be today, in terms of studying psychology, in a period equivalent to medical science when they were using leeches and bleeding people to get the evil blood out of them. That might be how primitive is our contemporary understanding of the human mind. So I would think there would probably be more computer simulation, and I'm hoping less torture of human beings. Nonetheless, the outcome might be similarly terrifying. Why did Americans not know that any of this was going on? Well, first of all, MK-Ultra in particular was absolutely top secret. I mean, Sidney Gottlieb lived in complete anonymity. I was writing a biography of a man who really did not exist. In the little town where I live, there's a retired gentleman who was formerly the head of the CIA. And I went up to him when I saw him with his shorts getting a cup of coffee one day and told him, I'm writing a book about a guy who was a big figure at the CIA in the 50s. And he said, no kidding, who's that? And I said, Sidney Gottlieb. And he said, never heard of him. And I think he was telling the truth. So it wasn't only secret from Americans. It was secret from everybody, even inside the CIA. But I think there's a larger question. It's not just that Americans are unaware that there was chemical experimentation and people were killed under torture in order to find out secrets of mind control during the 1950s. It's a much larger problem. I think Americans, like people everywhere, like to think the best about ourselves and about our country. We like to think that we're on the good side. We do good things. Every country has horrific aspects in its past, and that's particularly true with countries that are big and powerful and have global ambitions. It's sometimes difficult to grasp that, and there's a default inside, I think, everybody's brain that wants us to believe well about things that we're familiar with, about us, about me, my family, my friends, my country. That's just not healthy, because it should be more important to find out the truth than it is to find out things that make you feel good. On the other hand, why would you not want to feel good and aggressively go out and try to learn things that are going to make you feel bad? I guess one answer would be because you really want to know the truth about the world in which you live. But I can imagine many people feeling that that's too high a price to pay. I tell you something, after having spent 2 years writing Poisoner in Chief in that little room, I don't think I'd like to spend any more years in there. I'm facing other kinds of evil truths now. That one is evil enough, and I think I got to leave it. Otherwise, it's going to start affecting me in the way that those Gottlieb's patients were affected.
Yeah. Brilliant and fascinating, Stephen. It was so great to see you again. Thank you so much for coming back on. And thank you. I know I speak for many people who will never meet you. And thank you for your efforts to let the truth be known and spend your talents and intellect on this subject. So thank you so much.
It was great to do it. Thanks.